South Africa is barreling towards the 2024 elections, and whether you are sitting around a dinner table or you are debating it in the office, everyone is trying to grab their crystal balls and trying to predict, the outcome of what's going to happen, which is the most uncertain it's been since 1994. So we decided to bring in some expertise. Melanie Verwoerd is joining us today. She's a former ANC MP as well as the former ambassador to Ireland, to share some of her insights and analysis. Melanie, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Ilse-Marie, and thank you for having me. So, of course, the only question I've been asked for the last year, both by South Africa and international investors, have been election. So what's going to happen? What is the impact of that on coalitions? So I'm going to take you through a PowerPoint presentation on a number of issues. I'm going to work quite fast, but feel free. There's my email address on the screen. If you'd like to ask me some more questions afterwards, anybody, I'm very happy and open to that. So maybe first, just to start with some of the logistical issues, just quickly. We know the date now, 29th of May, of course, getting quite close now. 42.2 million eligible voters, of which only 65% have registered, which means 15 million have not registered. And interestingly enough, a little interesting fact, 3 million more women have registered than men. So political parties should take note of that. Just over 23,000 polling stations, neither here nor there about that. The IEC well used to doing that. And then two of the most unknown factors, the biggest unknown factors that could impact on the election and that we won't know in advance is, first of all, the impact of the youth votes. 5 out of 15 million registered, a little bit more than was at the local government election, about 400,000 more, but not in any way close to what should be there. 15 million is the total number of eligible voters under the age of 30. And the reason why that is significant is that we know that the ANC has basically got the over 30s signed up. People are pretty loyal about that when it comes to the black votes. And let me just apologize in advance. I will make the racial categories quite obvious, and that's because our voting patterns are so racially driven and they often are important to understand things. But when it comes then, so the ANC and the over 30s are pretty solid, but when it comes to the under 30s, then things start playing around a lot. MK is now coming to the game, but also EFF has historically got a lot more support in that group. So it's quite, it can be quite important, that turnout, to what extent that impacts on the national level and so on. The second one is turnout in general. And sometimes if you do follow polls quite closely, some of the better and the bigger agencies will tell you a low, medium, or high turnout. And that is because it impacts on the voting numbers, and particularly with the bigger parties. It doesn't really impact so much from the EFF downwards in terms of numbers, but it does with the ANC, and it can sometimes also impact on the DA numbers. It's not super dramatic, but it's 1 or 2 percentage points, and things are so close at the moment that might actually be important. It's not always that a high turnout benefits them equally and a low doesn't. It's quite a complicated thing, so I'm not going to go into that. If somebody's really interested, it's quite a nerdy thing. You can, like I said, email me or ask me afterwards. So what is new in this election? Of course, we're going to have 3 ballots, not just 2. 2 for the National Assembly, 1 only for the political parties, like we've had in the past. So they will only be the logos and the parties, and then 1 with parties and independents for the province that you are in. So every province will have a different one. And that's still for the National Assembly, because what they've done is in the new legislation, they've divided the seats in the 400 seats between the 200, which one can call national to national, and then provincial to national. I'm not using the legal terms that is in the law, but that's basically what it boils down to. The one will just have parties, the other one will have parties and independents. And then every one of us will also get a provincial ballot paper for the province that we live in. So all in all, each one of us will have 3 ballot papers, and there'll be 19 in total in the country. So 9 times 2 for the National Assembly, and then 9 times, so the 9 times 2 is 1 for every provincial legislature and the province to national, and then there's 1 the party list for the National Assembly, which will be the same all through the country. So there'll be 19 different ballot papers for each of us, just 3. The biggest challenge that I see from a logistical level is, in fact, the number of parties registered. This morning still, the IEC on their website is saying that there's 380 registered parties. Just to give you a comparison, in 2019, there was only 48. In 2014, there were 29. So I don't think it's particularly challenging for the IEC. Obviously, just a lot more paper to print, and hopefully that's not where we'll end up. We'll hopefully end up with far less parties. But even if it's half, it's still a very significant number of parties, and that's just for the national ballots. If you start counting all the provincial ones, it's close to, I think, 1,700. But of course, the question is, with that amount of parties, how are the voters going to negotiate a ballot paper that's going to be more like a book, or like Zapira was joking, their ballot paper is more like a toilet roll? It's going to be a challenge, and we're not 100% sure how voters are going to respond to that. The IEC usually draws a number out of there and a letter out of the hat to decide where they start. This time around, it is the A, so it's going to start with A. But if you actually just look on their website how many parties start with A, you can see what the problem might be. Very quickly, I just want to show you one or two things here. Remember, voter population by province also impacts on how many seats every province gets in the National Assembly, the 200 for the provincial to national. I'm not going to go into detail today, but just to show you the breakdown of the provinces and why we sometimes focus more on some provinces than others. Gauteng and KZN together makes up almost 44% of the total voters roll. And then comes Eastern Cape, Western Cape, and then Northern Cape is by far the smallest. One interesting statistic also about the Western Cape in particular is that in the Western Cape, 63% of registered voters sit in the municipality of Cape Town. So remember, those of you who know the Western Cape well will know what I'm talking about when I say, and the city of Cape Town cuts before Stellenbosch. So it includes Somerset West and Gordons Bay, but that's where it stops. So it doesn't even include the winelands of the Western Cape. So there's a huge, densely concentrated concentration of voters in the city of Cape Town, and then a lot less in the rest of the municipalities. That's very different, with the exception of Gauteng, which is of course just metros. The rest of the country, yes, a little bit more in the bigger cities or metros, but then it's actually fairly well distributed in the rural areas as well. Very different in the Western Cape. So I'm going to show you some polling here. I'm going to just ask you to first just bear with me, because I'm very concerned about some of the polls that are coming out in South Africa, because they affect the markets. People get panicky about it. And everybody is going to bring out a poll in the next 2 months or so, because it gets them great media coverage. So a few points to remember when you try and judge whether it's a good poll, whether you should get anxious or how much attention you should pay to it. First of all, remember that a poll is always just a snapshot of what voters are thinking at a very particular time. It's not necessarily a prediction. Until you get sort of into the last month, really 2 weeks, but let's say a month, that's when you can start sitting up if it's a good and a big poll. That's where you can sort of start paying attention a little bit, much more. Now it's actually more useful to look at trends and just be very, very cautious with headlines and headlines sort of going very alarmist around some of the polls. We still have a fairly long way to go. The ANC in particular rallies in the last 2 months. They push a lot of money in. I'm sure you've even seen that. They do a lot of campaigning in the last 2 months. So their numbers usually bump a little bit in the last 2 months or towards the end. And when you then look at polls, the best polls are the really big ones. I like them to be over 3,000. When you sit with the polls that are 800 or 1,800, that kind of size, and they claim to be demographically representative, and you have to spread them through 9 provinces, and you have to work with, race, gender, class, the sample sizes just get incredibly small, and it becomes very questionable whether it's how accurate it can be. It's also much better, and particularly in South Africa, to do polling in person. So in personal interviews, that's very pricey. So very few agencies do that, and they don't do it very frequently. Phone polls, we know, underpolls the rural areas and also underpolls, in particular ANC and EFF voters. They tend to be more suspicious when you phone them. They want to know who's phoning, why you're phoning, what do you want to know. So there's a lot more problems with phone polls. That's why also usually they self-declare margins of errors are much higher. Then of course it just needs to be only registered voters who intend to vote. If they're not registered or they don't intend to vote, well, then why are they in the poll? They're just skewing the poll. And then lastly, obviously demographically representative. So it is very important. Any good poll will declare all of those things, how the interviews were done, what the numbers were, did they only poll registered voters and those who intend to vote, or they will declare, that in separate numbers. If they don't, yeah, well, I think then it becomes a problematic poll. I'm going to show you 3 polls, and I'll go quickly through them, but I just want to give you a sense, and I didn't want to just use 1 or 2 polls that you don't, or 1 poll in particular, that you think I'm biased towards specific polling agency. This was the Ipsos poll, which came out in January. Ipsos is the old hand at this. They do very big polls, over 3,600 respondents. They do it face-to-face. But this is now getting a little bit old. We're hoping to have another Ipsos poll in a week or 2. The fieldwork was done in October, November. I think we had a lot of load shedding at the time, but luckily a very low margin of error. Probable choices where they, and Ipsos is one of the few who actually do this, so usually in months in advance, you sit with a huge group of people saying, I won't say, or I don't know, or I haven't decided yet, which then leaves you sometimes with 12 to 20% of people who doesn't want to respond, which is not very helpful. What they then do is they do in a very sort of slow, in a very meticulous and very experienced way, what they then do is they ask you other questions which might not look as if they are related, but they'll ask you about views of economic policy, presidential people, politicians, etc. And then they can, with very good accuracy, allocate your vote to where you will probably vote. And this is what Ipsos does. Now, I apologize with this online forum that we use, the poll numbers are disappearing there into the graph, but I'll read them to you. So Ipsos is saying gave the ANC just over 40%, the DA at around 20%, the EFF around 19%. They've consistently been quite high on the Ipsos polls. The IFP around 4.95%, Action SA at just over 4%, doing quite well. For New Kid on the Block, Freedom Front Plus at 2%, ACDP at 1%. And then they registered, that's Ace Magashule's party, ACT at 1.15%. So I will now, I'll explain to you a little bit more when I get to the next polls, but basically what you can see is the ANC obviously dropping significantly from the 57% where they were at, DA roughly where they're at, EFF coming up quite sharply from the 11 or 10% where they are now in parliament, IFP, Freedom Front Plus, ACDP very much where they are at currently in parliament. So Mark Data then brought out far more recently a poll in March. Their fieldwork was done in January, February, also a very big poll, also face-to-face. So very good numbers. When it comes to ANC, very similar numbers to Ipsos, around 41%. DA, very similar to what the Ipsos got, 20%. EFF a little bit lower than Ipsos, about 4%. And then because Ipsos couldn't at that stage yet measure, because they did the fieldwork last year, couldn't yet do the impact of MK. So for the first time, we suddenly saw the MK impact. But the interesting thing was the Ipsos poll last year, who couldn't yet measure the impact, it was too soon when they did the fieldwork for MK, came at exactly the same result. What you did see was that MK was definitely taking EFF votes, at least about 5%. They were also taking numbers from the Action SA, which is 4%. So it wasn't only ANC numbers that they were pulling. They were also pulling from EFF and Action SA. In fact, it looked like the numbers at that stage was very little of that actually related to MK when it came to the ANC. And the analysis that one can put to that was that ANC voters were already disillusioned, had already left the party last year, or over the last few years since the elections. Many of them joined the EFF, but then suddenly when MK and Zuma came in, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal, but also in Gauteng and in Mpumalanga, and the Zulu factor became a bigger issue as well for them, they then moved out of the EFF and went into MK. So in fact, EFF is suffering at the moment proportionately more than the ANC is because of MK. They had thought that they were growing quite fast in nationally and also provincially in those provinces in particular. And now suddenly, MK is starting to draw votes from them. And then, so what you can see is a drop in Action SA. Mark Data also very bold. The Freedom Front Plus very low. I think they would dispute that polling. They also dropped a little bit at ACDP. I wouldn't worry about that too much, margin of error. And then COPE is still crawling in there, which is really a big surprise to me. But they are still a little bit there. They'll get a seat or two. Of course, today, this morning, just as I was about to go on the call, it always happens, the Social Research Foundation brought out a poll. They didn't give us much information. They said it was a poll of 1,800 people. It's always, they do always telephonic polls, so I believe this one was 2. They didn't declare that. And their margin of error was 2.2%. What you can see there are 2 turnout scenarios, one that's 66%, which was the turnout in the last election, and they've brought it down slightly lower because I think there's generally a feeling that we'll have quite a low turnout or a lower turnout. And I should also say that Ipsos has consistently said that if we get a low turnout, so somewhere around 55% or below, that they believe that the ANC can still get between 45 and possibly even 50%. So I think some of the other pollers are not looking also at a lower turnout and not at the 66%. And what Frans Cornelius poll, this SRF poll, is showing, and what the markets got very upset about today, is the ANC at either 37 or 38%, the DA at 25%, so a bit higher than the Ipsos and Mark Data poll. EFF at 11, so lower, about 5% lower, and then MK is high. MK is at around 13 or 14%, so about 3% higher than Mark Data gave them. IFP, Freedom Front Plus, ACDP, and Action SA, roughly, I wouldn't worry about them. They all seem to be stabilizing the polling there. But just because it came out today and because it worries people a lot, let me just say, so at 38, which is at the 60% turnout, or even 37, with the 2.2%, and that's actually quite low for a phone poll, but that's what they're declaring their margin of error is. If it goes the positive way in the sense of more numbers, then we're back at 40%, of which is what Ipsos and Mark Data has said consistently. So I think the headlines, what freaked out the markets were a little bit the headlines, which I worry about, because I don't believe the headlines are actually accurately reflecting that there's not something really new going on here. There's actually very little new going on here. And the whole point that is being made around this poll is that the numbers are being taken by MK. Polls over the last year does not prove that out to be correctly. They are also, MK, like I've just said, is taking votes from the EFF and some of the other smaller parties. And then a little bit from the ANC, but there's not a direct link yet. And we have to see what MK is going to do over the next 2 months. Obviously, the fact that Zuma is there and now might help them, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. I'm just going to show you very quickly. Actually, at this stage, trends are more important. I didn't have time this morning to look at the SRF trends, but let me just, I know that they had a huge drop from their last polling from the ANC, but Ipsos, has shown consistently in the last year that the ANC was going down with about 10% over the last year. The DA grew quite well last year, but then sort of stabilized, and that's true all over with all the polls at the moment. The EFF was quite growing, but they now starting to go, they stabilized and now they are falling because of MK. And then the IFP has basically stayed stable. And like I said, sometimes these are more useful than the actual numbers. Look, the Zuma and the MK factor is the one thing that I find that investors are talking to me a lot, and of course, international investors in particular. We do need more polling. I would like to see the next Ipsos poll, because they haven't actually polled MK at all. That would be very significant. The SRF poll originally that they brought out, which caused a lot of concern, was only 845 people, 840 something, that was polled in KwaZulu-Natal. Very small numbers for such a big number of voters. And it was also a telephone poll, so I'm not sure. They then gave KwaZulu-Natal 24%, MK in KwaZulu-Natal, which would translate to about 5% in the National Assembly. However, Mark Data then brought out the bigger poll, and they gave them almost 11% in the National Assembly, which would be 40-something seats. And of course, what we need to look at in particularly is if Gauteng and Mpumalanga numbers are going to grow. They're doing very well in Mpumalanga. I'll show that to you when I do the provinces. About 7.7% in Gauteng at the moment, but do remember that both of those provinces have significant amount of Zulu-speaking people, about 20% in Gauteng and a little about 25% in Mpumalanga. Of the total voters are Zulu-speaking. Not all of them are going to vote for Zuma, but they will certainly they will grab some votes there. There is a question, of course, about violence because they are threatening, but I do want to say very clearly that I think it is always a possibility, and particularly in KwaZulu-Natal. But I believe, I'm very sure that the government is very confident about the information that they have. So unlike what happened in 2021, where they were caught on the back foot, they are prepared, they'll be watching, they're listening, people are being prosecuted already. So I don't believe that we'll see widespread violence like we did in 2021 after the election. I think the government will act very quickly and also have all the necessary military interventions ready and not take so long like they did. So if we're talking about national government scenarios, even with these latest polls, there's no question that the ANC will be the biggest party and almost 100% certain that they will be the governing party. It just, like I've said, says that the ANC can still get 50%. It's largely linked to the rural votes. If the turnout is very low, so somewhere between 39 and 40%. So generally, I think most analysts who's been in the game for quite a while feel that the ANC could still get up to 45%. Maybe 50% is a bit of a stretch if we look at the numbers where it is now, but certainly 45 still seems totally possible. If they get that, of course, they will form a coalition firstly with either the smaller parties, depending on how many seats they need, or the IFP or the IFP. If they fall below 45 and need significantly more numbers, then their first choice is absolutely the DA. It's not the EFF. The EFF story is a fear factor that the DA is trying to promote to get people to vote for them. The EFF is definitely not their first choice. Here, I do know the ANC well. I haven't been a member of the ANC for very, very long, since 2001, but I do know how they work, and I have lots of friends in there still. And they are all very clear, and that the NEC is also not keen on it, if the ANC, and they'll only go if that's the only way to stay in power. And in that situation, I feel very strongly that we'll have the DA to blame, because they would go first DA. But it is up to the DA to make their demands realistic, and also to make the deal for the betterment of the country. And of course, in Johannesburg, they didn't follow that process. They got very angry with, or they don't like Gates and McKenzie. So on that basis, they didn't make the deal at the city level of Johannesburg, which I think is very unfortunate in terms of service delivery, etc. in Johannesburg, which could have improved significantly. The whole noise around the multi-party charter is really just noise. They just don't have the numbers. The highest numbers that you see is 33. In fact, the mock data one puts them back down to 27. So the MPC is not going to make it. And do remember that their agreement only applies if they have the possibility of getting over 50%. If they don't, then the game is on. Anybody can make a deal with anybody if they want to. For a while now, there's been sort of silent whispers inside the ANC and also COSATU about the possibility of an ANC-IFP-DA coalition. I think that is a very significant possibility, because if you will see just now when I show you the provinces, that it isn't quite necessary in some of the provinces. And specifically ANC-DA is going to be a requirement in some of the provinces. As much as on national level, so that the EFF, if the ANC falls below 45, so that the EFF doesn't become the only option. And I do believe that the IFP will always be a factor, because Cyril Ramaphosa will not be happy just with an ANC-DA coalition, because it will cause a lot of stress and pressure for him inside the ANC and also from the outside, because he's already regarded as, apologies, but that's the language, too white. And therefore, just to form a coalition with the DA will play into those criticisms and put him under pressure. So I do believe that we'll see an ANC, if there's on national level, if there's a need for the DA, the IFP or some of the other black-led parties will be also as part of the coalition. Just one last little thing, no matter what all the noise is about the smaller parties, this doesn't take MK into account yet, but even with MK, the biggest parties all take about 80 to 90, the biggest three parties take about 80 to 90% of the vote. So people still vote very much. That's still where the major game is. And now with MK, just to watch because of the impact that it has on particularly the numbers. So if we move away from national, we look at the provincial stuff. The opinion polls are a little bit all over the show. They agree that the ANC in Gauteng will not have a majority. Somewhere around 35 and 45. For a while, it was below 35, but Mark Data gave them about 45. The DA, again, differs greatly. You can see that the BH is Brentis, and the CSN is the big one that Roger Dean's party did. They're not standing, but it was an interesting survey. Mark Data, the latest one, gives the DA about 20.2%. So that looks about, on average, the right way. The EFF somewhere around 15 to 18%. Actually, SA was polling around 8 to 12%, but Mark Data recently gave them 2.4%. So you can see they're losing votes. They've been a bit quiet as well. So they definitely, both nationally and provincially, are losing votes at the moment, which is interesting. And then MK is sitting at around 7.7%, and that is, as I previously mentioned, largely due to the fact that just under 20% of the population there is Zulu speaking. So if you then say, okay, what are the options? An ANC DA coalition is going to bring you somewhere between 51 and 55%, so that's okay. Action is ANC, not on the Mark Data data, but on the earlier numbers, could bring you around 47%. And then the ANC EFF will bring you above 50%. The multi-party charter will not get the numbers. If they want to get a minority government there, they will have to get loads of other parties. So we'll be back at the Johannesburg scenario, which will be very messy. So really what you're talking about, ANC DA, the IFP here is not significant because they poll around 1% always in Gauteng. So that's why IFP is not really in these options, but you can bring them in just to give you a little bit more cushion. So ANC DA is really most probably the preferred one. Then you most probably, the other option is ANC EFF, and depending on what Action SA does and what their numbers end up being, they might be an option for the ANC to go in with as well. Questioning if Amma Mashaba will agree to it, but that is definitely an option. KwaZulu-Natal, the difficult one. Oh, it's a very, very difficult province. The polls have consistently been all over the place, sometimes differing with as much as 17%. So, that's very difficult to work with because it's not within margins of error at all. So the numbers I'm giving you there is Ipsos, Brentis, and so on over time. Then you can see Social Research Foundation one, which came out. That's the 840 poll that I referred to earlier. And then the Mark Data is MD. That's the one that the most up-to-date one that we have. So ANC was sitting, of course, they came from a majority of over 50% in the last national election at 54%. They were sitting somewhere between 22 and 32%. However, the latest Mark Data poll put them at 13% in KwaZulu-Natal. So it's absolute devastation if that is in fact correct. People on the ground tell me it's maybe not quite that bad, but that's what the data is showing. The DA looks like it's somewhere around 13, not so much of a disagreement around the DA, somewhere around the 13, 14%. IFP was sort of 17 to 27%, but now Mark Data is giving them around 20 or 21%. We think when we look at the data that the IFP is also losing some votes to Zuma. So, but a little bit, not as much as for example, the EFF. And then the EFF, as you can see, the Social Research Foundation put them at 5% when they did their poll. Mark Data is putting them back at around 10%. So very much not clarity around the EFF. And then MK, Social Research Foundation, as we said earlier, had them at 24%. Mark Data has them at 35%. So the one thing they all agree on is neither the ANC or the IFP have a majority, but now you have to ask how much is MK going to get to try and work on that. Very, very messy. So let me show you the coalition options, as you can see. So first, I'm just going to work with not bringing in the Mark Data numbers there at the bottom, but just what between Ipsos, Brenthurst, and SRF. ANC IFP could bring you up there, or could in the past, if those numbers were correct. DA IFP was just below that. They got very excited at some point, the DA in particular, thinking that they could take the province. I don't think that there's any chance anymore. ANC EFF would not make it, nor will an MK and an EFF. They were too low. That was until Mark data came out. Then things changed dramatically. So if Mark data is correct, and if these numbers hold until the election, an ANC IFP election coalition brings you below 30%. A DA IFP coalition brings you just over 30%. An ANC EFF coalition brings you just above 20%. An MK EFF one brings you up the highest, which is second highest, which is 46%. An MK IFP one puts you over 50%. So if you work on Mark data, the only two-party coalition that will put you comfortably over 50% is an MK IFP coalition in KwaZulu-Natal. And whether they will work together is, of course, an interesting question. Alternatively, then you have to work ANC DA IFP. That could push you over just about to the 50% again. But this is, KwaZulu-Natal is a big question mark, and there's going to be severe consequences if that province doesn't stabilize and have responsible government. The Western Cape, of course, came from very high in the DA, 55.45%. In the previous national elections. The polls disagree again, and that's really where they disagree, 42 to 56%. Ipsos and Mark Data's latest polls put them at 47%, so not far over 50. The DA, depending on who you speak to, will tell you whether they're still in the 60s or in the high 50s. Yeah, I think that's just PR. There's nothing that seems to indicate that. In the last poll between Ipsos and Mark Data, the ANC jumped with 10%. The MPC, of course, the multi-party charter makes no difference in the Western Cape because of the dominance of the DA. And the reason why we think they are denying that, but there's no other explanation for it. The reason why the ANC is starting to go up, or went up from towards the end of last year to March of this year, or to February of this year, and the DA dropped, was the only thing that happened that could have possibly influenced that was the Gaza-Israel issue. And we do know that the Muslim population in the Western Cape is about 6.6%. The DA, I think, made a very bad tactical error by going into the Cape Flats and painting over Palestinian murals. And the imams were immediately on social media, saying things quite correctly, that we never see police here, even ambulances can't get in here. But suddenly, when there's a mural, and the videos were there, the DA rocks up with police vans and security, and they paint over murals that mean a lot to us. And so they've been promoting a position where no Muslim voters should vote for the DA. That might not hold, but for now, the DA is certainly not in a very comfortable position in the Western Cape. I still believe that they'll get a majority, but it's going to be tight. It's not going to be super comfortable for them. Another thing just that I'm watching is we've seen a slight, it's significant, but it's from a very low base, growth in EFF votes in the Western Cape. Still in the low numbers. It's still low numbers, but it is growing, which is interesting because the EFF never had any presence in the Western Cape. Just lastly, two provinces that wasn't at play. They were all going ANC until MK arrived. Mpumalanga and Free State. Mpumalanga, the Mark data gave the ANC 41%, MK 22%, and that's got to do with the Zulu number of Zulu voters, almost a quarter, and the DA 15%. So at this stage, if those numbers hold, you will need an ANC DA coalition, and the ANC will not take Mpumalanga. Equally so in the Free State, the ANC numbers jumped to 42.3%. The DA is around 25%. The EFF is at 19%. So again, if those numbers hold, the ANC will need the DA as a coalition partner in the Free State. I just briefly want to talk to you about what happens after the election, and this is part of my last two slides. just because people seem to get pretty confused about this. The results get announced. Usually the EIC is saying about 3 days after the elections. Do remember that it's all incredibly transparent. All the parties watch counting. All the parties are there. It's nothing to do with that. Anything's in secret. It is virtually impossible to manipulate an election at that level in South Africa. Once the election results have been announced, Parliament has 14 days, and the Chief Justice then has to convene them. So within 14 days. I do want to warn that I think there's a chance that the markets can go quite crazy here if the ANC is dropped very low and they get anxious about an ANC EFF coalition. So just watch this as financial people. At that meeting of Parliament, which the Chief Justice then presides over, MPs get sworn in. They then choose the Speaker and the Deputy Speaker, and then they call for nominations for the President. There can be as many names as possible. They have to come from the floor, from the newly sworn in MPs. Of course, if you're the opposition, you wouldn't be so stupid as to, or hopefully not, to put a number of candidates in there, because you're just going to split your vote. But whoever gets the most votes, so not 50%, whoever gets the most votes, I've been assured of this numbers of times by parliamentary legal people, that person becomes the president. The Constitution does provide in Schedule 3 for a runoff, but that's only when two candidates get exactly this. The two top candidates get the same number of votes, and then the bottom falls out, and they keep doing that until you've got one person that gets more votes. Whoever then wins can then form the cabinet. So strictly speaking, in South Africa, you don't need 50%. You don't need a majority, outright majority, to become the president and form the cabinet. You don't even need an outright majority to pass legislation or ordinary legislation. You just need a majority of who's in the House. But of course, you run an enormous risk if you don't have 50% somewhere, or agreements to get 50%, because one, you can lose the presidency. If the opposition get together or can agree on one candidate, unlikely, can't see the DA and the EFF agree on the same, or MK at this stage now on the same candidate. But if they could, through some magic, then of course they could win. And the same is true of ordinary legislation. Apart from that, your big problem becomes when you want to pass money bills, so budgets and any money bills, you do then need an absolute majority. So irrespective of everything, they will have to get a 50% agreement somewhere. So one would assume that in those 14 days, because that's usually the question I get, when will we know what the coalitions are? So somewhere in those 14 days, we'll get a pretty clear indication. We should, in order for them to get the president elected. Just quickly around that. So Ramaphosa, this is Brent, has did this. When you ask favorability ratings from people, nobody's doing that well. Nobody's passing. Nobody's above 50%. But so Ramaphosa is still the highest. Jacob Zuma is now coming in at around 29%. Then Julius Malema at 25%. Interestingly enough, Julius and Helen voting around the same, getting the same approval ratings, which surprises me. Musi Maimane is doing very well and still doing very well, in particular in the Western Cape. John Steenhuisen down at 19%. And I have to say that's where the problem for the DA lies, because look, he's only got 6% more approval rating, higher approval rating than Hamid Mashaba. Hamid Mashaba is polling around somewhere between 2 and 4%. John Steenhuisen is trying to be in the 20s or in the high 20s. There's a problem, and that's definitely a problem for the DA. Peter Groenewald Mngezi from the IFP, and then Zongezi Zebi keeps coming in. He's definitely more and more known as an individual, even though the party itself is not quite up in the polls yet. So who will be president? Well, it will almost certainly be an ANC president, despite what Jacob Zuma is trying to make us believe. Then if you ask me whom, Cyril Ramaphosa will definitely be with us until the elections, unless something absolutely catastrophic happens. And hopefully he is there for taking us through the negotiations with coalitions, if that is what's required, and it most probably will be, that he will then get there, because that's his happy space. You know, he's the negotiator. He could, of course, also form a government of national unity and just invite everybody into cabinet, you know, just unlimited seats. I mean, that's his happy space, and he will be good at that and take the country through it. The bigger question is then how long afterwards will he still be there? Can't answer that. I think nobody can answer that except him. It is true, of course, if the ANC does worse, very bad, so below 40%, that the risk of him resigning will be high. I would put it as quite high then. Whatever the scenario is, though, I'm pretty sure that it will not be an aggressive issue. He's not going to let the ANC vote him out, or NEC, as we had with Zuma. He will resign. He will go. He will do the gracious handover, which is really what worries international investors. At this stage, his successor will most probably be Paul Mashatile. And of course, a few questions around Paul and his personal financial issues, etc. If it's not him, it's very, very likely that it will be him. If it's not him, the person who's next, the more obvious candidate, will be somebody like Ronald Lamola. Both with Paul and Ronald, I'm not too worried about their policies in terms of the markets. I think in terms of, from your perspective, there's no serious issues around that. And with that, I'll stop. Yes, I sometimes get people a little bit depressed, so I just throw this quote in to make them smile. I don't believe that there's a big crisis looming at all, and in fact, I think even though the scenario will look very different, there's very little to panic about at this stage. Thank you, Ilse Marie.
Thanks, Melanie. You definitely gave us a lot to chew on, and it's such a good reminder to not jump when we look at headlines, because it's so easy, and there's various reasons why we have those grabbing headlines in our newspapers and in online news articles, but one should try and approach it with as much rationality, I suppose, as one can, even with a difficult election like this one coming up. I just want to throw over to ETM Analytics Director and Head of Research, George Glenos. George, any questions for Melanie?
Yeah, thanks, Melanie, and thank you for also taking the wind out of my sails on a few of my questions, because you answered them as we were going along. But it was a fantastic presentation, so thanks very much from us. But if I'm reading you correctly, and the way I've kind of pieced what you've put together for us, would it be accurate for me to say that you believe?
I'm sorry, George. I'm sorry, you're breaking up enormously, so I can actually not hear a word. I don't know if Ilse Marie can hear you and can maybe tell me, or else, yeah, we can just try again.
I can hear George fine. George, do you want to try again?
Yeah, let's try again. Firstly, I was just thanking you for a great presentation. I'm hoping you can hear me now. Not?
No.
But I can hear you. So relay.
All right. Let me just try, and Ilse Marie can. I'll keep it short, and Ilse Marie can just relay onto you. It sounds like the most probable outcome in your scenario would be a centrist coalition between the ANC and the DA, if I'm reading you correctly. And why that's important for me is because the markets have positioned themselves for potentially an ugly outcome. And an ugly outcome might be an ANC hooking up with an EFF or an MK party, or the EFF and the MK teaming up with other parties to try and dominate a particular line of thinking within government. In other words, entrench themselves within an alliance with the ANC, such that it's almost the tail wagging the dog. And that, to me, didn't sound like a plausible outcome for the ANC. And as a result, am I correct in saying that the more centrist position of the DA lends itself to a more probable outcome as a coalition arrangement with the ANC?
Yes. I think what you need to understand is that there's not a lot of love lost between the EFF and the ANC, contrary to what people would like to, are sometimes told. There's a lot of personal issues between many of the ANC people and Julius Malema. Secondly, they have learned from local government level how destabilizing and chaotic it is to try and work with the EFF. They've also not forgiven the EFF for storming the stage, not this last SONA, but the previous SONA. So they are scared, maybe, and very uneasy. Also, the ANC is a fairly, I know people might now laugh if they think about some of the corruption, but in the way that the ANC approaches things formally, they are very proper, very procedural. And so they don't like that kind of chaos and the sort of, unruly behavior that they see from the EFF, and that worries them quite rightly on a national level. Look, they don't want to be in a coalition with the DA either, because of course the challenge is going to be that the policy positions are quite far apart on many issues. The DA is perceived by the ANC as very arrogant, the DA leadership, and they worry, and they also feel that it sometimes edges on they're sort of on the edge of racism. They would argue they are racist, many times. So it will be a begrudging one, but if they have to choose between the two, they would rather go DA, if that's the way to go, because they believe that it would be more stable. And they understand very, very well that the biggest threat to the country's markets, economy, etc., is chaos and instability on a national government level. And so then they prefer to do that. That's what they're telling me, and that's the NEC's position, etc. Informally. I don't think they've just formally taken a position on it.
And Melanie, is there anything for the DA to lose by teaming up with the ANC? I mean, as we go into these elections and people have this perception of the ANC being a corrupt party that's presided over SOEs failing, that's presided over several municipalities failing, that's presided over degradation in fiscal, the country's fiscal position, and a whole range of other things. If the DA had to come in now, would they not be coming in at a sort of a really low level? So in other words, the base is really low. Any gains that come out of that coalition, are they not more likely to be attributed to the DA? In other words, people will see the way that the Western Cape, for example, is governed and automatically assume, that the DA has now brought its superior administrative abilities to bear, and therefore things are now improving. In that particular instance, would the DA not be able to frame itself as the party that's come to the savior of the country, and to be able to make itself shine within a coalition while still not taking the top positions because of the obvious shortage of votes relative to the ANC?
There are risks for the DA. Undoubtedly, there are risks. I mean, globally, we know that the smaller parties, the weaker parties in coalitions, usually in the next election get punished, because exactly the point that you're making, they get tarnished or absorbed by the bigger majority parties. So there is a risk. There's definitely a risk for them, and I'm sure they think about that a lot. What is also different on a national level is because the ANC will be the biggest party, they're not going to have the administrative control which they will have that they have in the Western Cape. They won't have that in a coalition agreement to the same extent. So there are risks for them. The point is, from a market perspective and also from an individual voter or citizen's perspective, the point is that if they don't go into a coalition with the ANC and the ANC needs the big numbers, it's going to be the EFF. And so they really will need to do what is best for the country. And they will have to take the bigger good of the country and not just the inward-looking what is best for the political party. I do have concerns about that because they haven't often shown that kind of approach. They haven't. One of the most famous examples was, of course, now that's a long time ago, when they first put the issue of the previous public protector on Parliament's agenda, and they wanted impeachment proceedings. The ANC then went to them and said, we actually agree that she should be impeached, and of course she was in the end, but it took many years. But let us drive it as the ANC. Let us do it because we believe it's more powerful, it's easier, it will be. And the DA wouldn't agree to that and said, no, this was our idea. We pushed it. We want it. What's in it for us was the answer. The problem with that is, of course, then it took a couple of years extra. And the other example is, of course, Johannesburg, which I mentioned, where Helen Zille stopped a coalition that was about to be signed. I know this from the inner circles, and not ANC, but from the other parties. And the IFP, Action SA, and DA would have formed a coalition together with the Patriotic Alliance, because there's no other way to get a majority. You have to work with the Patriotic Alliance. And Helen Zille wouldn't let them do that. And so the approach was a little bit, let the city burn, rather than get our hands dirty and so on. And that's a problem. That's a really, really big problem. So I trust that the DA will understand that the voters will also penalize them if they do not go into a coalition. It's not going to be let us swoop in then with the next election and win the majority, because then we'll clean up. It won't work like that. So let's hope that that exactly the scenario that you painted, that's the way we'll end up, that they understand that they can actually lay some claim on improvements.
And it's also been quite interesting to see John Steenhuisen walking back, because he initially came out and said that he won't be working together with the ANC. There's no reason to be thinking along those lines. The DA is going to be able to do what it wants to do with this multi-party coalition, etc. And then when he was on a panel discussion, and he was pushed by a particular audience member. But what if you don't have a choice, and you are faced with the prospect of a coalition with the ANC? What would you do? Would you just walk away? And his answer was quite an interesting one. He answered that it would depend on who was sitting across the table. In other words, he had walked it back a little bit, and suddenly it was a case of, well, if Cyril Ramaphosa is still there, then there's the potential for us to do some sort of a negotiation. If it's not him, and it's somebody more disagreeable, like a Paul Mashatile, for example, under those circumstances, would he be prepared to go into negotiations? And the distinct feeling was that he wouldn't. Now, again, so that plays into what you've just spoken about now. And I guess the next spring off question to you is whether Paul Mashatile does stand a chance of becoming the next ANC president.
Yeah. So let me just say about John's positioning. I've always laughed. Of course, he can't say at this stage. Well, I mean, there was a bit of a backlash when he said that in the interview, in the TV appearance. And so now he stepped back again from that positioning. It's just stupid. He should just answer and say, I will do at the time, we will think about what is best for the country. That's all he needs to say. And whatever that means, because the point is, I don't know any, or very few, political parties that will not be tempted by power, and so they should. I mean, if voters give you, 20% of this country is going to give you their vote and say, we want you to actually govern, we would like to see you govern, then you get the opportunity to be part of that government, not exclusively, but you get part of that government. And now you say to your voters, actually not, we're not going to do it. That's problematic. It's a problematic positioning to hold. Yes, Paul Mashatile, there's a very good chance to become president after Cyril Ramaphosa. We'd have to see. Of course, you can see they're letting this whole press, etc., sort of let them try and see what they can find around Paul, if there is actually issues. I don't know. Paul is either very good at hiding things, really good, because our media our investigative journalism is so good in this country, and our forensic journalism, or it doesn't seem like there's such a big problem, because they haven't been able to make anything really stick on him. Yes, there's the issue about who's paying all his previous girlfriends and lovers, but it doesn't seem to stick in any serious way. They talk about the Alex Mafia, but those are former ANC friends of his. So, there's let's see how that plays out. I think people are concerned about whether Paul Mashatile is close to the EFF. He was in the past, but so were many, many ANC people. And he's a very pragmatic politician in the sense that he understands what's good for the country. And I don't believe that he will, just because of Paul, now suddenly go with the EFF. I speak to many of the ANC people who know him, and they don't believe that either. So they feel strongly that he won't. So I don't think per se, and I don't think when it comes to ideological positioning around the markets in terms of, business, etc., that there's a big problem with Paul. I don't see that. Do also remember, which is part of the thing that's been frustrating the markets, is that the president, an ANC president, never makes decisions on his own. It's always or her own. It's always done with the NEC. And I think that's frustrating at times, which is also what's been paralyzing Cyril at times. But on the other hand, it also prevents them from just going completely on their own tangents and doing something crazy. So, like in a way, Zuma at times did, and that's why he lost his positioning in the ANC. So I'm not super worried about Paul. Not necessarily a big fan, and I think Ronald will be most probably a better candidate, Ronald Lamola, but Ronald is very young still and might need to go into the deputy president for a while first.
Okay. And then perhaps just a final question from me before I throw it back to Ilse Marie. This whole Zuma uprising, if you like, that's materialized in recent months. I mean, it's been quite staggering for me to see just how much support that man is still able to generate, because quite literally in the space of a few months, he, if the polls are to be believed, is generating more support than Julius Malema and the EFF have been able to build up through the course of time. And that for me is potentially throws a couple of curveballs into the political arena. And I'm not quite sure that either the polls fully capture the effect of MK, and you're quite right, we need to wait for the latest polls to really perhaps better understand. But to your point that you made right up front, there's serious problems with the polling that takes place in South Africa, and they haven't exactly covered themselves in glory in historical elections. So what would be an outlier scenario that could bring Zuma into play? I mean, this whole case in the electoral court yesterday that Zuma won, has it just given him a whole bunch more credibility than he otherwise would have had? Has it raised the profile of the MK party now to such a degree that perhaps even the 10, 12, 13% might be wrong? I'm a little bit concerned about how quickly his star has risen back up or bounced back up from where he was, through the course of 2022 and 2023. So it has been a meteoric jump in a very short space of time. How much more is there to come from Jacob Zuma? And, what would be an outlier scenario that perhaps hasn't been covered in the press that we need to look out for?
So let me just, a few points. The first thing is to remember the EFF is still nationally higher than MK. There's not 3 to 5%, depending on which polls you look at. I think there's a number of factors that one needs to look at. The first one is, why is he doing so well? The first one is the Zulu factor, and he's blatantly playing that card. So that's a very dangerous card to play in South Africa, very dangerous card. But he's pushing the tribal factor really, really hard and riding on that. Secondly, he's playing into, and then let me just say on that, I mean, I've known for many years now that in KwaZulu-Natal, him and many of the people there in the ANC talk about the vendor when they refer to Cyril. They don't, to the president, they don't talk about the president, comrade president, or whatever. Very problematic. Secondly, obviously he's tapping into disillusionment with the ANC, and particularly in KwaZulu-Natal, in Mpumalanga and Gauteng, but mostly in KwaZulu-Natal, and particularly with lack of service delivery at a provincial and local level. So he's tapping into that. Like I said earlier, I mean, people had already last year, from what we can see from the polls, in June, July, the big Ipsos poll showed already 20% of people that was not interested in the ANC anymore. And they was undecided. And the ANC had already dropped quite significantly at that stage. Zuma didn't exist at that stage on an active agenda anymore, political agenda, and MK wasn't registered yet. But then what happened is Zuma comes up, MK comes up also, EFF at that stage had grown to about almost 20%, 19.5% in KwaZulu-Natal. What then suddenly happens is MK comes up, and this disillusioned bloc goes, oh, hang on a minute. He's giving us an option. So instead of not voting, maybe we'll just go with Zuma. Equally so, a lot of those who went into the EFF suddenly goes, let me move over to Zuma. On SRF's poll, they drop, EFF drops from 90% to 5%. A little bit now, it's 10% on mark data. So it's already a disillusionment. So I'm just saying that to say meteoric growth, more that it was sitting there. There was a group of ready to be taken, and they went over there. The question is now, can he and MK do a lot more than that? Can they eat in more and more and more, which they clearly are, of mark data to believed, in KwaZulu-Natal at least, they are eating more and more. And the reason why that's reverberating on national level is just sheer numbers. They make up 20-something% of the national vote as well. So it's a lot of people in KwaZulu-Natal. And then, a little bit in Gauteng. So it's impacting there. That's how it's impacting. Whatever it is, they are not going to be, well, there's a very, very small chance, 1%, 2%, maybe less, that they'll ever end up in cabinet after this election. So at most, they'll be able to make, like the EFF currently, a lot of noise. They can't do anything more. He's not going to be in the union building as much as he says he's got unfinished business. So that's not going to happen. The only thing they can do is actually make a lot of noise in parliament. So let's not get too worried and too caught up about them, because I think part of the problem they're also growing is because the media is giving them so much attention. Yes, yesterday's court case, for the attention that they got, will also help them a little bit. It was a weird ruling, and of course we don't know the reasons for the ruling yet, because they didn't give any reasons, but I think it's got to do with this, pretty sure it's got to do with the fact that he only served 3 months, then got medical parole, then got a pardon. So they are taking that as the sentence rather than the 15 months he originally got. So I also believe that they are going to be, at this stage, it looks like they will be a one-term party, and that they will drop off quite significantly at the next election. The reason being that at the moment they have very little to offer except Zuma. There's not really any significant policy decisions. They won't be able to show any delivery. They won't be, and he's old. So the point is, unlike Julius, which was also sort of the big thing in the EFF and still remains, Zuma's not going to be there with the next election. He maybe as a sort of Robert Mugabe type figure, ancient and sitting somewhere on a chair, but he's not going to be, he's 82, and if we are to believe, he's really sick. Maybe not, but he's old, he's elderly. So I think that they will be a bit of a flash in the pan for now. Is there a way that they can do something really bizarre? Nothing in the poll shows that yet. The SRF poll doesn't indicate that. Mark data didn't poll that. Let's see what the next Ipsos poll shows. But I don't believe that you'll get any suggestion that they can get close to, or importantly, they and EFF together, because they might now bind together in their voting patterns, not join as a party, but at least vote together and work together in parliament. At the moment, together, they're the highest polls would put them around sort of 23, 24% combined. There's nothing that suggests that they can gain another 25% to get to a majority, combine, the EFF and MK. I don't know if that helps you. It's a long answer.
It does, and I think it will ease some concerns across financial markets to hear you speaking like that, because quite allied to that is that we've also seen a lot more activity on the part of the law enforcement agencies, the NPA, the Special Investigative Unit suddenly seem to be kicking in and doing a lot more work than they have done in quite some time. I don't know if that's a sign that the Ramaphosa administration has finally getting to grips with corruption in this country and starting to make inroads, that they've cleaned out enough of the ANC to allow them to be able to do something like that. And it's obviously going to be comforting for people to know that a Jacob Zuma, even if he had to make parliament, is not going to be able to participate properly in a cabinet and therefore be able to influence process again. So, the combination of all of that, I think, is probably a comforting thought for many, and perhaps a good reason why the Rand doesn't need to necessarily take a further wobble on the back of what we're seeing at the moment.
No, it doesn't, because, first of all, like I said, just on the SRF, and I just want to make a comment about the corruption issue. On the SRF poll, if you work with the margins of errors, it's actually back where Ipsos has been and where Mark Data has been. So there was no reason for the drop today. I think what worries people is just the growth, that they suddenly saw, but even that in MK. But remember, as long as MK is not in cabinet, they can't do anything. Policy is decided in cabinet, not even by individual ministers. So even if Zuma becomes a minister, he can't make, and he won't, he cannot go off and do his own thing. If he becomes minister of land, he can't just suddenly bring in expropriation with that. It gets decided on cabinet level. So one needs to remember, one needs to just take a deep breath and say, it doesn't change anything. The only thing it's doing, and that's the problem with markets, it's changing sentiment. People are feeling unsure. People don't like it. So it's changing sentiment. But it can't actually in reality do that much once they're in parliament. That's why I'm saying it's always very helpful to know about procedures and how parliament works. Just on the NPA and corruption, and I know people might not agree with what I'm saying now, but let me say that I actually think that this has been one of Cyril Ramaphosa's big triumphs, is actually the extent to which he's been able to deal with corruption inside the ANC and in the country generally. Of course, we still have loads of corruption. And of course, there are still a lot of corrupt politicians. But Ramaphosa was the fact that he has survived so long within the ANC, after what he did with the open letter, bringing in all the other issues, changes in the ANC, is absolutely mind-blowing to me. I don't think any other previous ANC president would have survived that. When I came back from overseas in 2012, and I was really shocked at what was going on. And I would speak to ANC people in parliament, etc., etc. I know Ilse Marie was working there as well. I'm sure she can vouch for that. Everybody was really quiet, and people would whisper to you and say, that one's involved in corruption. Don't say I said it. Everything was quiet. And people were really troubled by it, the good ones that were still there. Of course, then Cyril comes in, and it's a whole new feeling inside the ANC. Things change because there's a new sheriff in town, and people know they're in big trouble now. It's not actually accepted. People did get fired. People did get moved out of parliament. The NPA has got nothing to do with the president or with Cyril Ramaphosa. He is very clear, correctly so, unlike Zuma, saying there is a concrete wall between me and the NPA. And the political parties. He cannot impact, because that can go for good and for bad if you start impacting, as we saw under Zuma and with Sean Abrams, was it? Sean the Sheep is all that I have in my head. Because once your head of your NPA starts getting influenced by political parties, it's very, very problematic. So Cyril's been very clear about that. And so the slow prosecution level has got nothing to do with politicians. What it has got to do with is that it was always going to take time, and that they always, because the law turns slowly, but also because the NPA knows that if they're going to take up on the big guys, they're going to take on Julius Malema, if they're going to start taking on David Mabuza when he was deputy president, you better be sure that you're going to win the case. Because if you don't, as we've seen with Zuma even yesterday, you have a very negative fallout. It's not neutral, it's negative. And so that was always going to take long. We still have a corruption problem, as most democracies in the world have. We might have a bigger one because of the Zuma legacy. But it's certainly not accepted. It's certainly not endemic like it was under Zuma. It's not part of the culture anymore. It isn't. And that I will absolutely vouch for. But we still there's a long way to go to clean it up completely.
Thank you, Melanie. From my side, I think that's the sum total of it. So I'll hand back to Ilse Marie, and Ilse Marie, take it from there.
I feel like George, like you took the wind out of my sails. I have no questions left, and I came so well prepared. So Melanie, thank you very much for your insights and your analysis. like I said, I think you gave us a lot to chew on. And like you said, sometimes we just need to take a deep breath. Remember, it's a headline. Read deeper and just understand that in reality, it might not play out as some of the circus would like us to believe. So, Melanie, thank you very much, and all the best, and we will chat in the future.